Welcome back to another episode of Prep Talk, Preparing for the Kingdom. You know, friends, it's good to be back. We got Mark here again. Today's episode, we're going to be talking a little bit about biblical prophecy and whether or not the Bible can actually predict the future and that kind of thing. This is actually one of my favorite subjects. So we talked a little bit last episode about whether or not the Bible was a valid book that we can, put emphasis on. And against other writings, it pretty much stacks up that you can. And so we'd like to dive a little deeper in this episode into that and look at some of the predictions that were written in the book and see whether or not they actually came to pass. So what do you think, Mark?
Well, and that's a big factor that helps us trust the Bible at its word, because a lot of the things that were written in the Old Testament actually ended up coming to pass just as it was said it was going to. So that allows us to go, if anybody makes a prediction about anything, they do it once. You have no reason to trust them. But when it actually ends up coming to be and it becomes fulfilled, well, then you go, oh, well, wow, they might have been on something. And then if they do it again, and the more often they do that, the more you're going to trust what they say.
Yes, exactly.
And so this is what, if we look at the Bible, we can actually see how history has actually been playing out the way that God has told us it would go. And so we can look at some of these things and investigate this deeper. But of course, like we do in every episode, we like to go out to the streets and get people's thoughts on this ability to know the future.
Yeah, well, let's head on out there. I'm sure they have lots to say.
Well, today we're here out on the streets of Nelson again, and we're just asking people their thoughts on the ability to tell the future. Do you think it's possible for people to know the future?
Quantum physics says there are an infinite number of possibilities and an infinite number of circumstances, so that would allow for the possibility, for sure. Probability is different, but yeah.
But I guess in that scenario, you wouldn't be able to know specifics, though, I suppose, hey? If there's an infinite number of possibilities.
I think the paradox that I was told is knowing a future changes it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people debate that. So, yeah, for sure.
Okay, so, what about people go to psychics or read their horoscopes or things like that? How do you feel about stuff like that?
There are a lot of factors in those, right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of, those are human connection based things. And definitely the perceptibility of group trends for horoscopes and for psychics, the personal connection can influence that a lot. Not ruling it out, but I think a lot of just having to read the future is it's just letting go and letting chance kind of take over, not trying to know it at all, right?
Well, with everything going on in the world, there's a lot of things going on with the pandemic and wars and politics and maneuverings and all these things. And we find a lot of people are kind of seeing that it almost seems like there's a hand in that, that there's it almost seems organized a little bit, we're finding. But, in regards to knowing the future, how do you feel about some of the ancient writings that have made predictions of things that will happen in the world? Do you give that any consideration at all?
I've read some Nostradamus. I found it pretty compelling. So yeah, for sure. Ancient writings, again, context, right? Like there are many different societies, the Babylonians. There's been many predictions by many different groups of people. I think that, I had a friend and he was trying to find a wife. He was really excited on finding a wife, and he'd visualized this wife in his mind. And he went on dating sites and he willed it to happen, and he went everywhere. He went parties, he tasked every girl out, and it took 10 years and he was terrible. He was giving up, and then he spilled coffee on a girl, and now they have 2 kids. The future, it can be manifested for sure, but I find often it's the gust or the butterfly wings theory, not the hurricane, which will cause the great effect.
Right.
So a lot of times people see a massive kind of conspiracy or something, shaping the world, and it can just be somebody dropped a vial on the street in China, and then we're all instantly instantly, everyone's affected, he'll never tell, because why would he, you know, or somebody. Like, it can be, life could have been an accident. We don't know. So that's kind of my theory.
Okay, right, yes. That's a good question. I mean, I think part of, like, I don't know, I guess my thoughts about it are like, not knowing is like kind of part of the fun, you know? And like, if we knew, you know, life wouldn't be so adventurous, and I think that that's part of what, you know, makes life so fun.
Right. Well, we find with a lot of things going on in the world today, you know, there's a lot of, with the pandemics and the wars and things going on, you know, when political things happen, even on the other side of the world now, it affects us even here in little old Nelson, you know, and so, you know, we find this causing a lot of people to, you know, start to maybe get a little bit scared and wondering what's going on, and so, you know, maybe people are a little bit wanting, you know, it would be nice to know, you know. And but even before that, you know, people have gone to see psychics, or you know, they read their horoscopes, or, you know, how do you feel about things like that?
I think psychics and horoscopes are super interesting. Like, I indulge myself, but I mean, in my line of work, I'm a psychotherapist. So when you talk about people wanting to know the future, part of what I hear is people trying to regulate the fear and sadness that they're going through, and how knowing the future would give them some sense of control and having a greater sense of predictability, which can make us feel more comfortable. And so I totally respect that. I get how that would make us feel more comfortable, you know.
So what about some of these, the ancient writings? There's been a lot of ancient writings that have made predictions. You know, the Bible has a lot of, you know, a lot of the Old Testament were written by prophets. And so there's a lot of prophetic things in there. And, you know, and to a lot of people, we look at those, and some of them have actually come to pass. And so, you know, there's a lot of things that were written in the Bible that haven't come to pass yet. And so, you know, a lot of people, us included, we give it some credibility. How do you feel about, like, prophetic things like that, like in the Bible?
I guess I would say that, like, I mean, and I don't know how entirely correct this is, but I allow myself to indulge in, you know, kind of maybe if I have no sense of control over it and don't know if it's true or not, then I allow myself to have kind of some naiveness with it. And that includes like stuff with, you know, I guess stuff with, you know, religion and the Bible. Like if I have no sense of its accuracy or not, then I kind of allow myself to just like see what happens without thinking too seriously about it, I guess.
I think context is important. Some people have a great pattern recognition, like they can see how things will play out probability-wise to a certain extent. As for knowing what the future holds accurately, I don't think that's possible. I think we can infer, and we can also BS ourselves into believing or editing our evidence and narratives to prove something we want to be predestined.
Right.
But I don't have a very linear perspective on time myself.
So how do you feel about some of the ancient texts? You know, like some of the ancient biblical writings, there's a lot of prophetic stuff in a lot of these ancient writings that seem to have actually, you know, been fulfilled. And then there's things that obviously haven't been fulfilled yet, so it kind of makes us go, oh, well, you know, those things happened just as the writing said it would happen, so, you know, maybe these other things. How do you feel about those kind of sources?
That is part of it. I mean, if you're speaking in terms like Nostradamus and some of these things that have come to pass, but I mean, at the same time, we have to take into account, again, our ability to bullshit Can I say that?
Yeah.
Okay. To bullshit ourselves into believing things. Dr. Robert Anton Wilson said, what the thinker thinks, the prover proves. You will evidence arrange everything to suit your narrative. So who are we to know if it's actually come about, or we just witnessed something that fit the bill to suit our fantasy?
I would like to say yes, but I don't think so, simply because we have all the access to what has already happened. We're pretty good at learning the past, although the history books always seem to be written by the victor, so take it with a grain of salt. But we don't learn from the past, so I doubt we can see the future.
So how do you feel about some of the ancient writings, like say biblical stuff? A lot of the like Old Testament prophets made a lot of predictions, hundreds of years in advance, and when you look at history, a lot of them seem to have been, seem to come to pass too.
I think people were a lot more in tune. I mean, there's so many just distractions of everything nowadays. When people had a lot more time to sit and reflect, and like communication used to be a lot slower. When you wrote a letter to somebody, you would think about what you were going to say, because it was going to take however long to get there, and then they would have to think about responding. So I think, maybe in our rush to make everything faster, better, quicker, more convenient, we kind of have lost maybe some of that focus.
And we're back. I really appreciate the opinions that these people have to say. We talked to a number of people. Unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties, so we weren't able to air everything that we filmed. But there was a varying degrees of opinions on it, right? Some people believed that you could that you could know the future. Some people thought that it was kind of 50-50, sort of. Some people thought you were in control of your own destiny. So I was just interested to find the differences. Like, there was quite a range, actually, if you think about it.
Well, and a lot of people seem to make reference to you can know the future more in a personal sense. There's definitely people seem to be okay with the idea that what's my future going to hold, but more to know the future on a more of a global or long-term sense, in a humanity sense. It doesn't sound like anybody was really sold on that.
Right.
And the consensus definitely seemed to be across the board that there is an element of we are in control of our own future in the sense that we affect it. Like many said, once you know your future, then it changes because you're going to act differently because you know what's coming. So there's a cause and effect relationship there. Right.
Some people did say that, and some people also thought that they didn't really want to know their future. Like they were like, I just kind of want to live and experience it as it comes. I actually kind of thought that was interesting, because I'm more the type of person I kind of want to know what's coming. Right, I want to know what to prepare for. Well,
especially when things get kind of interesting and kind of scary, it would actually be comforting to know that there was a plan in place. Some people brought up a few times Nostradamus was mentioned.
Yeah, quite a few times.
Quite a few times, actually. And Nostradamus is interesting because he was a seer, basically. But his process, his source, was visions, was hallucinations. He would do things with a bowl and vapors and things, and I don't know what all he was putting in there, but there was a meditative process that he would go through, and then he would have these visions, and then he would just write them down. And some of them, if you read some of his writings, they're really vague.
Okay.
Like some of his predictions are really vague and could actually be applied to a lot of things, so once something happens, then you can look at that and go, oh, well, that actually kind of sounds like that. Oh, okay, well, then Nostradamus made a prediction. So that's kind of the sum of his predictive value.
And I don't really like that personally. I mean, if it's going to be kind of a hit and miss kind of, it'll work sometime, but not all the time thing, I don't know if I'd trust that personally.
And that's what one of our interviewees stated too, that with astrology, some planetary alignments, and certain stars are in a certain portion of the sky at a certain time, and for some reason that affects your life. That's basically what astrology is. And she said in her experience, sometimes it seemed to line up, and it worked, and sometimes it didn't. So a random hit and miss kind of a thing. And it's the same thing with the I Ching. I don't know if you've heard of that. That's a Chinese fortune telling process. And it's the same thing. The predictions, the proverbs, and the things that were written that you get directed to are just so general that they could just really be applied to
just about anything.
Just about any event.
Well, like we have our fortune cookies that we get in our Chinese food, right? You know, like predicting, you could just put it to anything.
Yeah. And the horoscopes, and people brought that up too. They're so general and they're so vague that they could be really interpreted. They're open to interpretation.
Exactly. Yeah,
so that seemed to be the understanding that a lot of people that we talked to had.
Yes. So that begs the question, is the Bible the same way? Is it open to interpretation? Mm-hmm. Or does it have a concrete foundation to work off of?
Mm-hmm. Well, so that's what's interesting. When you actually look at the things that the Bible has written, when you look at these prophecies that some of the prophets have written, some of them are really specific, like not like what Nostradamus wrote or any of these other things. Some of them are really specific, and so they're so specific, in fact, and this is what we talked a little bit about last time. It is brought into question about when these things were written. Mm-hmm. A lot of people actually, I did a presentation on Daniel a while back, and I found a lot of people, scholars, reject the time of the writing of Daniel simply and purely based on the fact that they don't believe that he could have told the future. So it must have been written after.
Interesting. Yeah.
So they have no other reason to reject the date of its writing except for that, because they don't want to accept the possibility that he could predict the future. And so we can look at some of these ones from Daniel. Is really interesting. You mentioned he talks about the succession of kingdoms coming up,
right,
and that's a big one that people reject that because it's so obviously accurate. Well, it must have been written in the first century then.
Well, no, you mean the first century AD? Yeah, like after Rome, because he talks all the way into Rome in that, right?
Yeah, but here's what's interesting is Daniel never actually mentions Rome.
That's
by
right.
name.
No.
And so we have these succession of kingdoms. As we know, Daniel claims to have written in the time of the Babylonian captivity. So this is when after Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem, took a lot of them captive, and you can corroborate that event with historical writings. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there's no question about, yes, that happened.
Yes.
King Nebuchadnezzar invaded Israel and Jerusalem and took a bunch of them captive. That's history. That's not Bible. That's history. And so during that time, Daniel was one of these captives, and this is when he wrote and he received a lot of these visions from God. So he has this vision of this succession of kingdoms, and actually that's what's really interesting is that it wasn't even his dream, was it?
Oh yeah,
it was King Nebuchadnezzar's dream.
Yeah, with the image. Yeah.
It was actually King Nebuchadnezzar's dream that he wanted to have interpreted.
Yeah.
And so
what did he do? He goes and calls all the soothsayers and the astrologers and all these different people and brings them all in, and they couldn't tell him the dream. So
then Daniel comes in and he prays, and then God gives Daniel the same dream at that point. So that's a really interesting point, because it actually wasn't Daniel's dream.
Yes, it wasn't Daniel's dream. He prayed for it, and so then he had to go into the king and tell him the dream that the king had. And as soon as the king started to hear that dream, he's like, "That's exactly what I dreamed." Right? So how can you lie about something like that? Is what I'm trying to say, right? How can Daniel come into the king and basically spin a story, and then the king agreed, right? Well, and that was one of the tests he actually gave with his own wise men. They asked him, "Tell us the dream and we'll tell you the meaning," and he said no. So this actually gave Daniel credibility, because Daniel was able to interpret the dream without him having told him it. Mm-hmm. So what happens then is Daniel mentions, and he does mention, that the king of Babylon is going to lose his kingdom to the Medes and the Persians. Mm-hmm. He outright says the Medes and the Persians are going to come and
And so, but then he mentions another kingdom after that that's going to overthrow the Medes and the Persians, but he doesn't mention at this point
Who they were.
the name of that kingdom.
Yeah.
And then he says another kingdom, and he doesn't mention the name of that kingdom. Later in another dream that Daniel has,
Yes.
it's revealed to him that that third kingdom is Greece.
Right.
And so then he mentions, so he has the current kingdom of Babylon, he has the next kingdom that comes and overthrows them, are the Medes and the Persians. And then that kingdom is overthrown ultimately by a Greek king. And then
Was that Xerxes that did that?
the Greek king
Yeah, I don't
was
remember.
Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great, because wasn't
Yeah.
he talked about like 150 years before in the book of, was it Isaiah? There was trying to remember the book, but there was a prophet in the Bible that talked about that happening before even it was around.
Well, this other vision that Daniel had refers to this. It was a vision of a shaggy goat with two horns,
Right.
and he travels very rapidly across the land. And of course, this is how Alexander the Great
He was, yeah.
conquered. He's just swept rapidly. His armies just overthrew things so quick that people couldn't even blink.
Yeah, they couldn't prepare for it.
Yeah. It was a very fast sweeping force that Alexander the Great had, and so we can look at history, and that's the thing, is we look back at history, and that's exactly what happened. The Medes and the Persians overthrew
Yeah, Babylon. And
then the Medes and the Persian kingdom was taken over ultimately by Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then in this prophecy for Alexander the Great, it says that his kingdom is divided up into his 4
Right.
leaders. And that's what happened.
Yeah.
We look at history and we go, well, that's what happened. Alexander the Great's kingdom was divided amongst his 4 generals.
Yeah.
So, we can look back in history and go, wow, well, that actually played out very much like these dreams that Daniel had. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's this 4th kingdom that's not mentioned by name, but it is mentioned in its locale and its power and its force, and given a lot of characteristics. And we know from history the kingdom that overthrew and took over was then, of course, Rome.
Rome, yeah.
And so this is why people reject Daniel, because they're like, well, that's just so specific. It's so specific that it had to have been written during the time of Rome's power.
That it's either that or it's actually prophecy.
Or he was actually given divine insight.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting because some of our interviewees actually, agreed that it is actually possible if somebody has that gift or they have some source that tunes them in.
Well, I mean, even some of them are saying that, if you understand quantum physics, then yes, it is possible for us to know the future, right? Like even mathematically, with all the computing power that we have now, they're saying that yes, we can. So what I took away from that is they were actually saying, we know enough now that yes, it is possible for these things to actually be true, right? Mm-hmm. Scientifically is what I'm trying to say.
Well, and like people said, if you were able to get kind of outside of the space and time, and so that you could see everything in that big picture, then it would be possible. Mm-hmm. And of course, as Christians, that's exactly what we understand. Yeah. We understand that our Creator God is outside of space and time, and He can do exactly that.
Yeah, exactly.
So I thought that was an interesting point. So the thing is, which really brings it home with Daniel is another prophecy that we can look at. Okay, so maybe Daniel was written in the 1st century after these kingdoms all ruled. Okay, well, maybe that's possible. But we look at another prophecy that he had, and it's called in a lot of the Bibles the 77s, or the 70 weeks. And this is a time prophecy. This is a time prophecy, and it's time stamped, which makes it a really interesting prophecy because it covers a period of time. It's given a start point. It's given an end point, and it says during what's going to happen during that span of time, what's going to happen at the beginning of it, what's going to happen at the end of it. Like, this is really some really specific stuff.
Right. Yeah.
And it's over such a huge period that it makes it really hard to question. It's not just over a week or two. So what 77s is 70 weeks. Some Bibles will say 70
weeks.
70
I'm
weeks.
pretty sure that the King James says 70 weeks.
Yeah.
70 weeks is determined upon thy people.
Right.
So
Right. So you can find this prophecy in Daniel 9 for anybody wanting to look more into this. And in Daniel chapter 9, and so it starts out by giving this time, and it starts out by saying there's 70 weeks, 70 sevens for God's people. And then it breaks it down into, it starts with 7 sevens to rebuild the temple and the streets. And then it goes to another 62 weeks or 62 sevens. So when we figure this out, a week is 7 days.
yes, yeah.
So 7 sevens would be 7 weeks. 7 times 7 is 49 weeks,
Yes.
right? And then the 62 would be 62 times 7. That's 434 weeks. So you add those two numbers together and we get a total of 483 weeks. So how do we go from weeks to years, though? Because the understanding is that this is a year prophecy. And so 7 weeks is 7 years. Well, that would equate a year to a day.
Right.
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 So we got 7 weeks or 7 days, or what he's saying is 7 periods of 7 years. And then we got 62 periods of 7 years. And so we have a total of 483 years. And so this is really interesting because when you look at the things that have happened, he gives a period of time, and he says the start of this prophecy, he gives a start date. He says from the going forth of the command to rebuild the temple and the streets.
Right.
And then of course now we can actually look into history, into the Babylonian captivity, and we can actually see a record of where Israel was released from Babylonian captivity and were allowed to go back to Jerusalem during the times of Ezra and Nehemiah. They were allowed to go back and start rebuilding the wall, and then they were able to eventually rebuild the temple and the streets. And so we can actually look at history and pinpoint when that time was, with the king that was ruling, the king that issued the edict.
That's right. Yeah.
And so we understand that, I believe it's 457 BC.
Yeah.
Right? So now we have 457 BC, and then we're given a period of time for them to rebuild, 49 years for them to rebuild the wall and the temple and the streets. And then they go back and they re-inhabit. And then we have the rest of the 434, which brings us to the total of the 483 years.
And that was when the Messiah, the Prince.
And then it says at that point, this is going to be the coming of the Anointed One, the Messiah, the Prince.
Yeah.
And so we look at the history and we can see what happened is this was the time when Christ was baptized. And so, because he was.
That's when his ministry started, right? That was when his official ministry capacity started. Was when he was baptized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and we can see that to be about 27 AD.
Yeah.
And so we know that because, again, the history books tell us who the ruling emperors were and the Jewish leaders were at that time. And so, again, these time stamps are matching up with recorded history. And so it's really interesting to see how this played out. Again, if Daniel wrote this all after the fact, that's one thing. But for these to be so specific and covering this time span, it really calls into question. And of course, with the Dead Sea Scrolls that we talked about, the biblical copies that we have are disproving this idea that it was written 1st, 2nd century AD.
Yeah.
Because we're finding older and older copies. We're finding older references also, which is important. So Jesus talks in the Gospels about, he makes a reference to Daniel's prophecies. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. Well, we have copies of the Gospels from the 1st century where Jesus said this. And he's referring to these Old Testament writings from the prophet Daniel, who they understood to be in the Babylonian captivity.
Yeah, so
not somebody that was alive at that same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so there's evidence from the other writings that give us credibility to show that this Daniel was actually written and was actually part of the Old Testament canon. So we have the Messianic, the Masoretic texts and the Greek Septuagint and all these things too, which come from before the time of Christ. So again, the book was in existence prior to these events happening. And so it really brings into the question, of course, the prophecy goes on, well, 483 is not 490, right? We're missing 7 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so it goes on and says that after the Messiah, the Prince, is anointed, then there's one more 7 where he confirms the covenant.
Yeah.
And of course, God had a covenant with Israel.
Yeah.
And he confirms this covenant with the many for this one more week. But halfway through that week, it
The
says
Messiah
he
would
was
be
cut off.
Yeah.
And he puts an end to the daily sacrifice.
Yeah.
Well, what happened is once Jesus was anointed, he ministered for 3.5 years. That's half of 7. And at which point he was cut off. He was crucified. And when he was crucified, the veil in the temple was torn from top to bottom, and it desecrated the holy place of the temple.
That's right. The most
And
holy.
they were
Yeah.
no longer able to offer sacrifices there. And then, of course, 40 years later, the temple was destroyed
Yeah.
and burned to the ground. And it's interesting in Daniel, he says, until the time the desolations are poured out on it, he says the temple remained desolate. It was left desolate because of all these events. And to this day, 2,000 years later,
It's still
the
desolate.
temple is still desolate.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting when you look at that and see how Daniel's prophecies, they played out. They played out. Well, Daniel has a lot of other prophecies too that
Well, and
are
we
talking about the future.
haven't finished that one prophecy there. Like the Messiah was cut off on that middle of the last week there, and what determined the final part of that was where Israel had stoned Stephen.
Right,
and
because there's still another 3.5 years.
That God had given them another 3.5 years of grace after they crucified Jesus, and that was the last straw. Basically, that was when Israel had fully turned away from the Messiah, and so then that was when the prophecy was fulfilled.
And then after Stephen was stoned, then the gospel started going out to the Gentile nations and to everybody else.
Exactly.
Which fits right in with what the angel told Daniel. I give you 490 years for God's people to make right for sin and all these things. So God had given Israel 490 years into the future from the time of Daniel to get things right, to prepare for the coming Messiah. And when that time ran out, then the gospel went to the Gentiles. And so we can see that, that's exactly how it played out, just as it was told.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite ones I want to touch on a little bit too for prophecy, and I mentioned this last time, was the book of Isaiah, because we have a physical, literal copy of the book of Isaiah from before the time of Christ. So there's no question that this was written before the events. And Isaiah makes a lot of prophecies, of Christ. So Daniel's already prophesied a coming Messiah in his time prophecy, and then we have Isaiah making a lot of the prophets did, but Isaiah brings up. I like Isaiah because we actually have a physical, literal copy that we know was written before the events happened, and so these are some of the ones that Isaiah talks about, and a big one is Isaiah 7:14 mentions that the coming Messiah that Daniel has promised and Moses has promised. In Genesis talks about it as well. Promises that the Messiah would be born of a virgin. Well, that's a pretty hard one to make happen.
Yeah, pretty hard. Yeah.
Some people say, well, this person just was familiar with these supposed prophecies and they just made them happen, and so they fit the bill. Well, how do you make that happen?
Yeah, how do you make a woman pregnant without? Yeah,
and so the question then would be, was Mary actually a virgin?
Yeah,
so, but as the story goes, as the gospel writers recorded, was that there was a problem because Mary was betrothed to Joseph, and Joseph was all worried because Mary was now pregnant and it wasn't his.
Yeah.
So her getting pregnant and not being out of wedlock was a really bad thing. And as we mentioned last week too, the fact that the Bible records these things actually gives it credibility.
Yeah.
You know, if they were trying to make a fake story, that would not be something you should include, you know, because that just really made them look bad. So we see that one. Isaiah talked about this, and Isaiah wrote 600 years before the time of Christ. He also said that the Messiah would be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. You know, and that's what happened. They called him Emmanuel. Isaiah 53 says that he will be rejected by his own people. And John, one of his followers, records that that's exactly what happened, is that his own people didn't want to listen to him. His own people turned their backs on him, would not believe that he was who he said he was. And so that fit the bill with Jesus. Isaiah 11:1 says that he would be from Nazareth. He was a Nazarene. And but he was actually born in Bethlehem. And so that's a really complicated thing to fulfill too, because Joseph and Mary actually lived in Nazareth. But because of the census that happened, they had to go to Bethlehem to be counted in the census. So that's why they ended up in Bethlehem. Otherwise, he would have been born in Nazareth.
That's right, yeah.
Either way, he still would have been a Nazarene.
Yeah.
But Isaiah also prophesied that he would be born in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And so he's a Nazarene, not born in Nazareth, but actually born in Bethlehem, which is in Judea. And so we see these things like that Isaiah has talked about. He also mentions he would be sent to heal, and that's what Jesus did, a lot of healing. It's a lot of people. It was recorded that he was a healer, even in the non-biblical history. Josephus and some of the other early writers that we mentioned before recorded that he was believed to have been a healer. And so again, he was healing. Some other prophecies for Christ, not in Isaiah, a big one was the star out of Jacob was in the book of Numbers recorded. And this was actually how the wise men from the east understood what was going on.
Yeah.
So they understood that to be a prophecy for this coming Messiah, and that's what led that when they saw that star, they were like, hey, this is fulfillment happening. So they understood from this ancient texts that this was a prophecy, and so then they followed the star. They ended up in Bethlehem, right where Isaiah said he would be, and many of the other prophets. All these things were being fulfilled. So we have history of Bible writings coming to pass the way that the Bible said that they would happen. So this really gives a lot of credibility to it. So how that differs, like we were talking about Nostradamus, how that differs is this isn't just a vision and with some vague thing. This isn't just somebody seeing something and going, oh, you know, some generalization, and then people look later at history and go, oh, that's how it happened. These things are really specific. So specific, in fact, that it makes it hard to deny. To the point where the only explanation is that the writings must be in question then. But more and more as archaeology keeps going, we've seen that these writings actually exist.
Well, like you say, the book of Isaiah, right?
Yeah. So these aren't just crystal ball things.
Yeah.
So really, when God makes a prophecy, there's a little bit more involved, in the sense that it's almost better to think of it in a sense of promise fulfillment instead of fortune telling. You know, so when we ask people, can you know the future? Well, people are like, well, it's subjective and it's all, you know, and that's true. But when you look at something like a creator who is outside of time and space, and he has a plan for humanity that he's putting in place, then it changes how we view prophecy, because really what we're just seeing is God saying, I have a plan and I'm gonna play this out. He's saying sin has entered the world. There's been a curse of sin. People are driven towards evil. You know, that's a given. So we have these conditions that, and people brought this up that we interviewed. There's conditions that are part of the world, and when we look at them, we can have an understanding, well, because of this is likely to happen. So that definitely plays a factor in God's prophecies. But he's at war with the devil. And this is a big factor to understand, is that great controversy.
Yes, yes.
Because God is at war with the devil, so God knows how this is going to go. He has an adversary. And so God has a plan. And so he gives us warnings. And the Bible tells, Jesus taught, he says, I tell you these things ahead of time so that when they happen, you will believe. And so a lot of the things Jesus says, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. He said the temple is going to be destroyed and not one stone will stand on another.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was recorded. And the writings were from before AD 70, before the temple was destroyed and not one stone stood on another. So Jesus says, I've told you these things in advance so that when they happen, you will believe.
Yes.
So these Bible prophecies are warnings. They're warnings, they're promises, they're part of God's plan of salvation. So it behooves us to study these things.
No, I agree, yes.
Especially when it comes to end time stuff. And, so God is, in Revelation, God has told us a lot of things about natural disasters. He told his followers the signs of the end of the age: earthquakes, famines, pestilences, and wars and rumors of wars. And so, the reason why we started this series was, because of everything going on in the world today, there is a lot of things, and a lot of people are starting to ask questions. And we can really see in the Bible that God has warned us about the very things that are happening. And we see more how things have played out and are playing out as God has warned us. And so, God wants his people to know so that we are not in the dark, right? He said his coming is going to be like a thief in the night, and you get taken by surprise. But then he says to his followers, but you will not be taken by surprise because I've told you.
Yes, exactly.
So this is what Bible prophecy is all about. It's because a loving God cares so much for his people that he wants us to understand what's coming down the pipe.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
It's not just chance, it's not just, random. And probably the biggest thing, in light of what people have told us, there are things in the world that we can't control.
That is right, yes.
Right? There are things that happen and are happening that are out of our control. And they're happening because it's part of this great controversy between Christ and Satan. And so, those are my thoughts on the Bible prophecy. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I just, to me, these prophecies really, well, in my opinion, they prove the Bible to be accurate, right? That's one of the strongest evidences for me to take the Bible seriously is these prophecies, right? And the more that you study, the more that you get into them, the more it becomes clear. I would like to say to our viewers, if you want to study these prophecies, in depth and understand it more, like we haven't given all the Bible texts and we haven't given you the understanding of why, a day for a year and all these things, in this episode. But if you want to know these things, it is written in the Bible, and we'd be happy to study it with you.
And we can even put some links in the descriptions to some of the study guides that are available. To some of these interesting subjects.
Yes. So thank you again for joining us for this episode. We appreciate it. And like we say every week, if there's something that you would like to know, study or whatever, drop it in the comments below. And we'd love it if you subscribe to our YouTube channel and liked and followed our Facebook channel or our Facebook page. That would be fantastic.
And we're going to look at some more of these things that the Bible says in the next coming episodes as well. So hopefully you'll stay tuned with us and hope that you're all blessed by this.
That's right. Till next week.
Join Nelson Adventist Media on YouTube, Rumble, and Facebook for good sermons, praise time, prep talk, testimonies, health segments, and more.
Well, folks, I want to say thank you for watching our programming. But I would also like to invite you to further our ministry by liking and subscribing, both to YouTube and Facebook. That'd be wonderful. God bless you.